It's no problem for me to understand why people have anxiety disorders or why they're depressed or why they have substance use problems. The mystery to me is always why people don't have all of those things at once.
It engages a different system. Now, see, now he's getting into the neurology, all the potential threats in life. Then you can't ever be emotionally stable because there's... In this video, we're going to break down fear and anxiety from a psychological standpoint. And we're going to do this by watching a video by a very famous psychologist, Dr. Jordan Peterson, who is a professor of psychology from Canada. And he and I have pretty wildly different backgrounds. So I've been a life coach. If you don't know me, my name is Sean Smith. I've been a life coach for over 17 years. All right, I'm editing the video right now, and I literally just had to push away from the table and film this little thing that I'm going to put in the beginning, because about halfway in the conversation, he mentioned something that is mind-blowing and will totally change the way you understand the embodiment reaction to our fears. This is actually the first time that I've watched any videos from Jordan Peterson. I've heard his name a bunch, but I've just watched a couple of his videos today, and this one on fear and anxiety I think is really important to dissect and break down. So we're going to watch this together, and I'm going to pause at times and add my thoughts on top of it if there's anything that I agree with or disagree with. Maybe add more like common use language maybe, or examples or something that will hopefully land for you. So let's watch the video.
I've dealt with lots of people who have anxiety disorders, you know. And one thing about people who have anxiety disorders is they are not mysterious to me. It's no problem for me to understand why people have anxiety disorders or why they're depressed or why they have substance use problems. The mystery to me is always why people don't have all of those things at once.
So you can tell right away that he's talking about disorders, like from a clinical perspective. And I don't have any kind of background in clinical psychology, so I'm not going to come from that place. I'm going to come from more of the anxiety and fears that we all have.
Because everybody has a reason to be anxious. In fact, we have the ultimate reason to be anxious because we know that we're vulnerable and we know that we're going to die. And how you can not be anxious under those circumstances is a great mystery. It's a massive mystery. And the same thing applies with regards to depression.
Oh, I love that line. Like, how are we not all clinically depressed and anxious if we've got this thing called death, you know, looming over us, and we don't know when it's going to happen? And I think our peace of mind and our presence and calmness in our lives largely depends on our relationship to our death. To death in general. What does it mean to die? Do we feel like we haven't lived entirely the way that we want to, or haven't achieved the things or experienced the things that we really want to? And so the idea that we might die prematurely, which probably all of us will, like almost everybody I think is probably going to want to do a few more things, but the idea of premature death is enough to spin most of us, especially if we ruminate on it, into a depression of some sort at some intensity. So I think that's what he's opening up here, is like we all are dealing with the ultimate fear, the ultimate consequence. So he's like, I don't know, like I totally get how people have fears and anxieties. I don't understand how everybody doesn't have all of them all at once, which I think is an interesting piece. And it also speaks to the fact that we're all human and we're all going through very similar fears. And the way that a human creates anxiety is similar across the board. So our definition of death, our definition of the afterlife, our beliefs in whatever that looks like for you, our experiences on the planet, all contribute to whether this impending death is a bad thing. And the more that it's a bad thing, the more anxious that we're probably going to be about it, right? So that's just the recipe that we all use to create fear and anxiety on some level, just through normal day-to-day life.
And then the same thing applies to some degree with regards to drug and alcohol abuse. As I said last week, there's plenty of reasons to drown your consciousness in alcohol, that's for sure. We could refer to the aforementioned anxiety and depression, not least. And the sorts of drugs that people are prone to take are chemicals that take the affective edge off the tragedy of life.
They take the affective edge off the tragedy of life. So I fully agree with what he says here about drugs and alcohol. I don't think people take drugs and alcohol to feel anything. I think people mostly take drugs and alcohol to stop feeling something. And in his words, it's to stop experiencing the tragedy of life. One of the things that is kind of embedded in his messaging from a couple of videos that I've seen is that life is tough. You know, there's this primal component to life, and it's not easy. In today's world, we have so many potential distractions. We've got our social media, we've got the internet, we've got all kinds of things, you know, TV. We can dial up almost anything that we want to watch on YouTube or Netflix or whatever channels that we have. And to a large degree, those function as distractions away from the feelings that we don't want to have. And if we understand that the behaviors that we are partaking in, whether it has risen to what we might call an addiction or not, is really an avoidance strategy, then we can take a look at what is it that we're wanting to avoid. And if we have something that we're wanting to avoid and we use a behavior to avoid it, and then we use another behavior on top of that behavior to avoid the avoidance, we can pretty quickly create a cycle of avoidance that gets us several places removed from the actual thing that we are afraid of. And what Dr. Peterson is saying here, that ultimate thing is death. You know, and what's the meaning of who we are and why we are and where we are and what we are and just life in general. So how we relate to that tragedy of life, as he put it, is going to determine how often and probably how deeply we fall into fear and anxiety and depression at whatever level of intensity.
So back to the issue of fear. Abraham is self-conscious, that's what this commentary says, but the thing is he moves forward despite that. He's self-conscious and he knows the danger, but he moves forward despite that. And that's actually the appropriate response in the face of actual non-naive understanding of what constitutes life. Like if you're naive and you move forward, it's like, well, what the hell do you know? You know, there's no courage in naivety because you don't know what there is to stop you. You don't know what dangers you might apprehend.
There's no courage in naivety. That's a really powerful statement. Courage. Courage, I believe, where he's going with it, which I agree with, is confronting the things that need to be confronted, having the conversations that we need to have with ourselves or with other people, being real and transparent and honest with ourselves. That's the courage of confronting. That is addressing what needs to be addressed. And so what he's saying is, if you just stay naive and basically, you know, live your life with your hands over your eyes or your fingers in your ears, pretending that you don't see things, pretending that you don't hear things, or that you don't feel things, he's saying there's no courage in that. Now, I want to be clear that I'm not saying that people who have addiction, first of all, we all have addictions of some kind. Whether it's substance addictions or addictions to things online or just addictions to avoidance, I think we all have addictions of some kind. I want to be really clear. My personal opinion is not that anybody who has addictions or anybody who has avoidance strategies is not courageous in the sense that we use the word a lot. Like, it doesn't mean that you're a loser. It doesn't mean that you don't have any braveness in you. It doesn't mean that you're not a real person. It doesn't mean any of those things. He's talking about a specific kind of courage, not an all-encompassing courage, I believe. And it's the courage to confront. And ultimately, it's the idea that the only way through, or the only way to is through. I think that's the quote. The only way to something is through whatever it is that's in your way. So I just want to be clear that this isn't a judgmental position, that if you're not like leaning into all of your traumas and all of your emotions and all that stuff, then you're not a courageous person, blanket statement across the board. That's not what I believe. I'm not going to speak for him, I don't know, but I don't think that's what he believes as well, especially as a psychologist, I would imagine. So this is just in this context of experiencing life.
But to be aware of what it is that your problem is, so to be alert existentially, let's say, or to be fully self-conscious, means that you're perfectly aware of your limitations and how you might be hurt. And then to make the decision to move forward into the unknown and the land of the stranger. Anyways, I would say that's one of the secrets to a good life. And I can say that really without fear of contradiction, I would say, because the clinical literature on this is very, very, very clear.
Okay, I don't know where he's going to go in there, so I don't want to lose this thought. To go forward anyway, that's the key. I think too many of us are trying to find ways to avoid pain or vulnerability or upset and embarrassment. We've got all these uncomfortable feelings that we're trying to avoid. The problem is, as a human dealing with humans in a human society, we can't avoid those things. Like, that's a part of the human experience. The pain and the irritation and the fears and the doubts and the worries and all the things that most of us wish we could find a way to avoid, those are baked into the human experience. They're in the pavement. They're not obstacles that we can avoid. If you want to have a human experience, what he's saying is you've got to lean into those things that are a part of the human experience. And what a lot of people are doing in the avoidance strategies that we all have is we are trying to avoid the uncomfortable pieces of the human experience, but I would then say you're avoiding the human experience. And then what happens is you start to not trust yourself. If I'm afraid of having a certain experience, basically what I'm afraid of is my relationship to the experience and what I'm going to do after the experience and what I'm going to say about myself because of the experience. So really, I'm not afraid of the experience. I'm afraid of myself after the experience or through the experience. And so if what we're trying to do is continually avoid all of these negative experiences, basically what we're doing is we're avoiding ourselves. And when we do that over and over and over again, it creates a pattern of self-distrust, where we don't trust ourselves with ourselves. And if we don't trust ourselves with ourselves, then really the only thing we can do is try to avoid ourselves. I think that's the essence of what he's talking about here.
What you do with people who are afraid and to some degree depressed, but certainly anxious, is you lay out what they're anxious about, first of all, in detail. What is it that you're afraid of? What might happen? And then you decompose it into small problems, hypothetically manageable problems. And then you have the person expose themselves to the thing that they're afraid of. And what happens isn't that they get less afraid. That isn't what the clinical literature indicates exactly. What happens instead is they get braver. And that's not the same thing, right? Because if you get less afraid, it's like, well, the world isn't as dangerous as I thought it was, silly me. If you get braver, that's not what happens. What happens is, yeah, the damn world's just as dangerous as I thought, or maybe it's even more dangerous than I thought, but it turns out that there's something in me that responds to taking that on as a voluntary challenge and grows and thrives as a consequence. And
that's everything right there. So it's not that the fear goes away. It's that we rise to the challenge. My experience in the personal development world over all these years is that most people are trying to find ways to reduce their fear or get rid of it entirely because fear is uncomfortable. And we've got all these negative thoughts that are going on in our head. They're telling us that we're not good enough. They're telling us we're going to fail. They're telling us all these catastrophic ideas. So we succumb to those ideas and we think that if we've got all these negative thoughts in our head, then we can't go forward because it's It sounds really dangerous, it's scary, it's super uncomfortable for us. So it makes total sense that our idea would be, let's turn those thoughts off. If we could turn off the negative chatter inside of our head and maybe turn on the positive chatter that says, it's okay, you're going to get through this, it's okay, you're not going to fail, you're going to be able to overcome this, you're going to be able to succeed. If you ask that person out, they're going to say yes. If you take a risk financially, you're going to get a big old profitable return. We think that if we could change all of our thoughts to the positive ones, all about succeeding, that we would then have more courage and more bravery to take risks. And I disagree with the fundamentals of that belief, even though it's an extremely common one, because, as Dr. Peterson just said, the world will never get less scary. There are always going to be opportunities to fail. There are always going to be opportunities to be rejected. It's not about avoiding those opportunities, it's about taking them anyway. So instead of trying to build the avoidance muscles, or instead of trying to give yourself the guarantee that you'll never fail, it's a much more stable approach, much more calming, much more empowering approach to say, even though the world is scary, I'm going to go anyway. Even though risk is potentially dangerous financially or emotionally or sometimes physically, I'm going to do it anyway because the experience on the other side of that risk is worth the risk. But most of us are telling ourselves the experience on the other side of the fear is not worth the risk, therefore I'm not going to engage with the fear, and that's why we just want to turn it off. But in doing so, we don't give ourselves the experience of pride. We don't give ourselves the evidence that we can be afraid, we can have worries, we can feel depressed at times, we can be emotional, we can be vulnerable, and we can do the thing anyway. And if it doesn't work, we will still survive. That's the core thing. That's how fear operates. Fear basically says, don't do this thing because if you do it, we're going to die. Don't do this thing because there's a catastrophe waiting on the other end. So another piece to what he's saying is, when you take a step in the face of that fear and you prove to yourself that you didn't die, that actually creates more confidence in ourselves to take a step the next time. And he used the word bravery, which I think is a really powerful word and important to understand in this context. We have more bravery to go into the same old fears that the world has, or at least potential for fear. You know, I didn't mean to say that, but the world doesn't have fears. The world has opportunities. We look around, there's no fear around us because fear can only live in us. If I take a look at a bear over there and I'm afraid that that bear might kill me, then I'm going to create internal fear of that bear. But if somebody's never seen a bear or doesn't know that a bear could kill them, they won't create fear of the bear because they don't know about the catastrophe that might live on the other side of that. So when we look at all the opportunities that we have in life, fear is only created inside of us. So what does that mean? That means that fear is generated according to our relationship to the potential catastrophe. And if our relationship to the potential catastrophe collapses in our perception of risk, then our fear will also collapse. Because our fear is going to be proportional to our perception of risk. In other words, if something is likely to be absolutely catastrophic, our fear is going to be really high. But if something's not going to be that big of a deal, our fear is going to be really low. So what he's saying is that the more that we lean in and take action anyway, the more that we actually collapse the perception of catastrophe, because the more evidence we collect that we took action and didn't die, the more that this cycle builds on itself, and we don't even have the embodied fear of the things that used to shut us down. And that's all possible. It's not an overnight flip of a switch, but it's all possible if we're committed to leaning in, as he's talking about. Oh, this is so good. Like I said, I've never watched any of his stuff until today, and I really appreciate the clinical breakdown. and how he uses his explanations so succinctly and with actually a lot of simplicity. And that's another thing I think a lot of us miss, is the simplicity inside fears, anxieties, worries, doubts, head talk, limiting beliefs, all the things that we're wishing would just go away. We can actually go into them, and we won't be able to make them go away, but we will be able to lessen the effect that they have on us. Let's see what else he's got to say.
There's no doubt about this. Even the psychophysiological findings are quite clear. If you impose a stressor on two groups of people, and on one group the stressor is imposed involuntarily, and on the other group the stressor is picked up voluntarily, the people who pick up the stressor voluntarily use a whole different psychophysiological system to deal with it. They use the system that's associated with approach and challenge, and not the system that's associated with defensive aggression and withdrawal.
All right. I've not heard that before. The idea that when we voluntarily choose something versus something being chosen for us, in other words, instead of us being forced into a situation where we have fear, if we voluntarily enter the situation we have fear, it absolutely changes us. He just said, though, that when we use our voluntary mechanisms to go into a certain challenge, it engages a different system. Now he's getting into the neurology of our humanity. He's getting into the fact that it actually uses different parts of our brains. It engages different parts of our bodies. I've not heard that before. I totally agree with it. So it's kind of like let's say you've got two teams standing behind you. And in one scenario, you are thrust into a scary situation and you go kicking and screaming because you don't want to do it because there's a lot of catastrophe on the other side of that. Then the two teams behind you are going to hear how you are relating to the situation. And if you're relating to the situation involuntarily, no, I don't want to do this, well then team A is going to show up. And that team is going to be more concerned with self-preservation. It's going to be more concerned with judgment of other people. It's going to be more concerned with your safety. It's going to be all catastrophic in nature. It's going to be defensive in nature because it's going to show up and go, this person, our body, our human, doesn't want to do this thing, so let's try to protect them from the effect of this potential catastrophe. But if you knowingly and voluntarily enter into that, then Team B is going to show up. And Team B shows up with more aggressiveness. And I don't necessarily mean abrasiveness with other people and get into fights or anything, but they're going to show up with more presence. They're going to show up with more intention, more assertiveness. You're going to enjoy the experience. Even if you fail, you're going to enjoy it more because you've engaged a different system of your body and you've incorporated a different team inside of you that will then alter how you not just approach this, but how you experience it. And because it changes the way you experience the potential opportunity, it's going to increase the likelihood that you're going to succeed in it and decrease the likelihood that you're going to be emotionally or mentally destroyed if you fail. That right there, you guys, that right there is massive to understand. So the next time you have an opportunity to do something that might create some fear and anxiety, choose it anyway for the simple fact that you're going to recruit the right team members inside your body, and they're going to bring better memories to the forefront. They're going to give you more access to your wisdom because you're voluntarily choosing something. That's so big.
The system that is associated with challenge is much more associated with positive emotion and much less associated with negative emotion. It's also much less hard on you because the defensive posturing system, the prey animal system, man, when that thing kicks in, it's all systems are go for you, you know? The pedal's pushed down to the metal and the brakes are on. You're using future resources that you could be storing for future time right now in the present to ready yourself for emergency. So There's nothing simple or trivial at all about the idea of being called to move forthrightly forward into the strange and the unknown. And there's a real adventure that's associated with that, right?
So he was talking about the primal urges that we have and the primal desire to protect our lives. And when we use the defensive system, then, as he said, our foot is on the brake, and we show up in a way where we're telling ourselves this is extremely dangerous. And when we keep telling ourselves this is extremely dangerous, then what are we going to do? We're going to look for more danger. And then the cycle just kind of feeds off itself. I think the real key here to get in what he just said is that this is a primal component of our humanity. We can't just willpower our way out of our primal operating systems. We all have animalistic systems, and it's better to understand them and use them to our advantage than think that we can somehow avoid who we are in our nature.
So that's an exciting thing, which is part of the reason why people travel. And then also to see yourself as the sort of creature that can do that, is willing to do that on a habitual basis, is also the right kind of tonic for, I hate this word, for your self-esteem. You know, because the self-esteem has nothing to do with feeling good about yourself. As I already mentioned, there isn't necessarily a reason why a priori you should just feel good about yourself. But
so I don't know exactly where he's going to go with this self-esteem. Maybe he's going to unpack it. I think in a common, the way that we understand self-esteem versus self-confidence, I think it can be said that your self-esteem is really how you feel about yourself, how you relate to yourself. So I don't agree with that exact statement, but I'm sure he's coming from some other like clinical perspective. But I think that the key thing here is he said something like how you see yourself. If you see yourself as the person that goes into the adventures, then that changes everything. Because now it does increase what I believe is our experience of self-esteem, which is how we think about, how we relate to ourselves. And the more that we do hard things and come out the other side, whether we win or lose, actually doesn't matter. I think this is a key point. Whether we win or lose, whether we succeed or fail, actually doesn't matter in the specific relationship that we have to ourselves, with whether we approach difficult things and go into them anyway. That's like its own subset. Who am I when things get tough, and do I go anyway? That's actually a complete conversation regardless of how the scenario turns out. So that piece I think is really critical. And again, it will help you hopefully when you are approaching anything that might be scary, recognize that there's a piece of this that only requires I go forward. It doesn't require that I succeed. It doesn't require that I win. It doesn't require any results whatsoever. It just requires that I go forward. That's a subset, I think, of what I would say self-esteem and how it makes you feel better about yourself. But let's see if he completes that thought on self-esteem.
If you can view yourself acting in a courageous and forthright manner and encountering the world and trying to improve your lot and taking risks, in a non-naive way, well, then you have something that you can comfort yourself with at night when you're wondering what the whole damn point is of your futile and miserable life.
What's the whole damn point of our futile and miserable life? I'm kind of getting a sense of what his personality is. And I think he probably comes off gruff at times or kind of maybe even demeaning at times, but it's because he's really speaking to this primal experience of life. And I guess it can be miserable, right? I mean, we all have the opportunity for misery at least. And futile. Yeah, what's the point? Especially in the grand scheme of things, with how long humanity has been around and how long it'll continue to be around without us here. We're so small in the grand scheme of things, which actually I think helps us do big things. If we recognize that we're still so, no matter what we do, no matter how self-evolved we are still infinitesimal when it comes to the grand scheme of life on this planet. And my experience is when I recognize that whether this thing succeeds or fails or not, whether I win or lose, whether I've got a ton of money in my bank account or none, the effect that I have on my children or the impact that I have made, hopefully, in the people's lives that I've wanted to teach and coach and do all these things, that's what creates more of the lasting legacy that I am more committed to, not the specific details of wins and losses and successes and failures. So for me, when I realize that I'm really small, it actually helps me do things that could be really big. And even if they don't succeed, it tells me that I'm somebody that approaches and dives into hard things. I actually had a conversation with somebody very recently, and it was a massive realization for me when I recognized this piece, that whether this thing fails or not doesn't matter. What matters is, did I try? Because if I don't try, then even if the thing succeeds, but I didn't try, I won't feel good about myself. But if I try and put everything I have into it and the thing fails, I can still feel good about my efforts. I can still feel good about the way I approach opportunities, regardless of the outcome. So hopefully there's something in this conversation for you that will help you take action in the face of potential catastrophe and our futile, miserable existence.
And that's necessary because it's often the case that you wake up at 4 in the morning, or at least sometimes the case that you wake up at 4 in the morning when things haven't been going that well and wonder just what the hell the point is of your futile and miserable life. You have to have something real to set against that. It can't be just rationalizations about how, you're a valuable person among others, even though that's true. That's not good enough. You need something that's more realistic to set against that. And observing courage in yourself is definitely one of the things that can help you sleep soundly at night when things are destabilized a little bit around you.
Again, this distinction that he's making about courage, I think he used courage as a verb, couraging, which is cool. I've never thought of encouraging as like in the context of what he's talking about here. And if we change the encourage with an en to in, encouraging, can we take action in courage? And if we take action in courage, we'll increase the likelihood that we succeed, but we'll decrease the emotional devastation on the other side of it because at least we acted in courage. So this last point I think is really critical if we just wrap it all back around to what we started talking about in the beginning, that life and how we feel about ourselves, our self-esteem, our confidence, how we approach day-to-day experiences really has a lot more to do with how we see ourselves responding to potential catastrophe. Do we lean in or do we shy away? Do we voluntarily go toward it or do we involuntarily run from it? And that specific relationship to adversity is going to do more for our courage and our bravery and our self-esteem and our trust in ourselves and our confidence and our happiness and our joy and all the things that we want. That piece is actually going to increase all of those experiences that we want a lot more than trying to avoid the negative experiences that we don't want. If we continue to avoid all the landmines of life, we'll never actually enjoy the walk. So the video's over, but he's got this quote here: to be fully self-conscious means that you're perfectly aware of your limitations and how you might be hurt, and then make the decision to move forward into the unknown and the land of the stranger anyway. That's one of the secrets to a good life. So I'm really impressed by a lot of this conversation and the breakdown and the dissections and the points he makes. and where he's ultimately coming from. And if we can simplify the actual variables that are going on in our day-to-day experiences that are creating depression or anxiety or fear or worries at whatever level of intensity they might be showing up in your life or somebody that you know, if we understand the simplicity inside the variables, then we can maneuver, manipulate, dissolve the variables, and then as a byproduct, change the outcome. If you want a more emotionally stable life, that's the only way to do it. If your intention is to constantly maneuver around all the potential threats in life, then you can't ever be emotionally stable, because there's going to be an infinite amount of potential threats in the world. So rather than trying to reduce the number of threats, the better plan is to change the way you relate to the perception of the threats. Hopefully this has been valuable. If you have anything that you want to share about the breakdown, or any further questions that you have about anything he said, I said, or something that the conversation triggered, then please put a comment down below, and either my or my team will get to it as soon as we can. Take care. That was a deep one. Now, if you like this video, check out that video right there and get more strategies to help you overcome your fears. We're not controlled by anything that we seek out. We're only controlled by the things that we try to deny and we hope they never show up. That's why fear has such a grip on most of us.